Rabies kills almost everyone it infects. One bite, weeks of silence, then the brain starts to fail. Sleep goes first, then speech, then the mind itself. And nothing medicine has ever built can stop it. Most people assume this threat has been handled. Vaccines, animal control, modern hospitals. It feels like a problem that belongs to the past. That feeling is exactly backwards. This disease was terrifying people thousands of years ago, and what they believed was causing it is stranger than the disease itself. If the kind of history that never quite made it into your school textbooks is something you enjoy, go ahead and subscribe now. This is exactly the kind of story this channel was built around. Most people picture rabies as a footnote, something that shows up in old movies about frontier towns, or a warning sign on a hiking trail about raccoons. It feels contained, managed, almost quaint. But long before anyone had a microscope, long before anyone had the faintest idea what a virus even was, ancient civilizations were already documenting this disease in careful, specific, almost bureaucratic detail, because they had already learned, the hard way, exactly how dangerous it was. One of the oldest legal codes in human history, the Code of Eshnunna, written in Mesopotamia nearly 4,000 years ago, contains a law dealing specifically with dogs that show signs of madness. If an owner knew his dog was showing symptoms and failed to restrain it, and that dog then bit and killed someone, the owner faced a serious financial penalty. Think about what that tells us. This was not a vague fear of dangerous animals in general. This was a specific recognized pattern. Mad dog bites a person. Person dies. Someone is legally responsible for not preventing it. People had no concept of viruses or infection. What they had was generations of watching the exact same tragedy unfold, the exact same way, over and over, until it became something worth writing into law. Rabies doesn't leave bones behind. It attacks nerve pathways and soft tissue, none of which survive thousands of years. So, unlike some ancient diseases, there's no specimen sitting in a museum drawer to point to. What survives is something different. The words people left behind in law codes, medical writing, and myth. Because the disease was common enough and terrifying enough that civilization after civilization felt the need to write it down. The ancient Greeks studied it just as closely and got just as close to the truth, while still landing somewhere strange. The philosopher Aristotle wrote about the disease in dogs directly, describing how a mad dog would eventually die from it, and how other animals bitten by a mad dog would go on to develop the same madness. But Aristotle made one very specific exception. He believed humans were somehow immune to catching it from a dog bite. He was wrong, and that's worth sitting with for a second, because this was one of the sharpest minds in the ancient world, closely observing exactly the right pattern and still drawing exactly the wrong conclusion at the very last step. And it wasn't just the Mediterranean world paying attention. On the other side of the ancient world, an early Indian medical text known as the Sushruta Samhita, compiled roughly 2,600 years ago, contains its own detailed description of the disease, including the fear of water that shows up in advanced cases. Two civilizations with no contact with each other, separated by an entire continent, independently noticed and recorded the exact same terrifying pattern. That's not a coincidence born of shared superstition. That's two different groups of careful observers arriving at the same real conclusion from two completely different starting points. The Greeks did have a name for the madness itself, and it came from mythology rather than medicine. They called it Lyssa, after a minor goddess associated with rage and frenzy, believed to be capable of driving both animals and men into a violent, uncontrollable state. When a dog turned vicious and started foaming and attacking without reason, many people were convinced they were watching a kind of divine madness take hold of it. That word never really left us. The modern scientific name for the entire family of viruses that cause rabies is Lyssavirus, a direct descendant of a Greek goddess of frenzy, still sitting quietly inside biology textbooks today. Roman medicine pushed the understanding even further. A Roman writer named Celsus gave one of the most detailed clinical descriptions of the disease that survives from the ancient world, describing the fear of water that develops in late-stage patients, a symptom now known as hydrophobia, because swallowing becomes agonizing as the disease attacks the nerves controlling the throat. Celsus recommended cauterizing a fresh bite wound with a hot iron, trying to burn out whatever poison he believed was traveling through the body. It sounds brutal today, and by modern standards it obviously was, but it was also a serious, reasoned medical response to a disease that had no other known treatment at the time, based on the best information available to him. And then there's the belief that might be the strangest part of this entire story, exactly as promised. For centuries, long after Rome fell, and long into more recent European history, people believed a small worm-like growth under a dog's tongue was the actual cause of rabies. That growth does exist. It's a small strip of cartilage sitting under a dog's tongue, and it has absolutely nothing to do with rabies. But the belief was so widespread and so persistent that removing it, a practice sometimes called worming a dog, was recommended as a preventive measure well into more recent centuries, long after much of the rest of medicine had started moving toward genuine science. Veterinarians and dog owners were performing an actual surgical procedure on a perfectly ordinary piece of anatomy to prevent a disease that piece of anatomy had never caused in the first place. So, what is actually happening inside the body when rabies takes hold? The virus typically enters through a bite, then does something almost patient by comparison to most infections. Instead of spreading immediately through the bloodstream, it travels slowly along the nerves themselves, heading toward the brain. That's part of why the incubation period can vary so widely, from just a couple of weeks to, in rare cases, over a year, depending largely on where the bite happened and how far the virus has to travel to reach the central nervous system. Once it reaches the brain, it causes severe inflammation. And that's when the symptoms described in the beginning of this video start to appear: confusion, agitation, the fear of water, and eventually a complete shutdown of normal brain function. Historically, once those symptoms began, the outcome was almost never in doubt. Here's the part that might be the hardest to accept. In terms of pure lethality once symptoms appear, rabies has not really changed at all. This isn't like most diseases, where ancient suffering can be explained by primitive medicine and modern survival can be explained by better treatment. Even with every tool modern medicine has, once a person becomes symptomatic, the death rate remains close to what it always was, among the highest of any disease known to humanity. What changed wasn't the disease itself. What changed was our ability to stop it before it ever got that far. And it was never picky about its victims either. Nearly every warm-blooded mammal can carry and transmit rabies: dogs, wolves, foxes, raccoons, bats, even cattle in parts of the world today, which is part of why ancient people encountered it so often. So, did ancient humans actually get bitten by rabid animals more often than people do now? Almost certainly yes, and not for some mysterious reason. Domesticated dogs lived in close daily contact with people, none of them vaccinated, none of them monitored, in a world with no concept of quarantine at all. The exposure risk alone was dramatically higher than anything most of us will ever face today. Then came Pasteur. That breakthrough has a real name attached to it, and a real face. In 1885, a French scientist named Louis Pasteur developed the first successful rabies vaccine and tested it in a desperate situation on a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister, who had been severely bitten by a rabid dog. There was no approved treatment at the time. Pasteur had only tested his approach on animals, but the alternative for young Joseph was almost certain death, so his family made the decision to try it anyway. The boy survived. That single case opened the door to what we now call post-exposure treatment, a series of shots given after a bite, before symptoms ever start, that can stop the virus from ever reaching the brain in the first place. That's the tool ancient people never had. Someone bitten by a mad dog in Babylon, or in ancient Greece, or in Celsus's Rome, had nothing to do but wait and hope the animal wasn't infected. Today, if you're bitten and you get treatment quickly, before symptoms begin, modern medicine can stop this disease with remarkable reliability. The window before symptoms is where the entire fight happens now. Once that window closes, honestly, medicine still has almost nothing to offer. There have been a small handful of documented survivors of full-blown symptomatic rabies without prior vaccination, most famously a Wisconsin teenager, treated with an experimental approach involving an induced coma, but those cases remain rare exceptions, not a reliable treatment, and most attempts to repeat that success in other patients have not worked. One more thing deserves a moment before we wrap up, because it's easy to assume this entire story wrapped up neatly in that one Paris laboratory. It didn't. Global health researchers estimate that rabies still kills close to 60,000 people every single year, mostly in parts of the world where reaching a hospital and getting those post-exposure shots quickly after a bite simply isn't easy. The ancient fear wasn't irrational, and in large parts of the world today, it still isn't. And understanding rabies this deeply, all the way back to Babylon and Aristotle, is not just a history lesson, it's actively useful right now. Virologists today study an entire family of related viruses called lyssaviruses, carried by different bat species on nearly every continent, tracing how closely these strains are related to each other and to the classic rabies virus itself. That family tree helps scientists spot a dangerous new strain jumping from animals into humans before it becomes a real outbreak. The same basic instinct that made a Babylonian lawmaker write a rule about a mad dog nearly 4,000 years ago. Notice the pattern early, understand it. Close the gap before the gap closes on someone. One bite, weeks of silence. Then the brain fails, sleep first, then speech, then the mind itself. That's still exactly how this disease behaves, the same as it always has, the same as it did in Mesopotamia and in Aristotle's Athens and in Celsus's Rome. Rabies was there long before any of them had a word for it. It is one of the oldest predators the human body has ever faced. And for the first time in that entire history, there's a narrow window where we actually get to win. If stories like this one are exactly what you come here for, subscribe now and stay a while. History buried a lot more than we were ever taught in school.